So, when I read the letters of St. Paul, I sometimes find myself wondering, what the heck, Paul? And one of those times is at the end of Philippians when he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Because at least in my experience, if we see someone who's always smiling and never seems sad, we worry about them. When someone insists on finding the positive in everything, we want them to be quiet because some things simply aren't good and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. And if someone is just constantly happy while thousands die daily in a pandemic and fires and hurricanes rage around them, well, we would be wise to recommend therapy. And so I find myself wondering what St. Paul expected his readers to do with that command, rejoice in the Lord always. Because to continually and audibly declare that one is rejoicing in God all the time is a very good way to irritate everyone around you. Think of zealots who aggravate their friends by always talking about the same religious questions, or kids who annoy adults by singing the same song over and over and over again. Let it go already. And rejoicing always seems to necessitate rejoicing not only when life is good and you're feeling happy, but rejoicing when bad things happen and you're sad or angry or otherwise not in the mood to be joyful. And admittedly, Paul wrote this letter from prison, which gives us the sense that if he could somehow rejoice in God while being deprived of his freedom and with his life in jeopardy, then surely I can do the same, even if it feels like we're in the middle of the apocalypse. But in the rest of this passage, Paul suggests that rejoicing always does not just mean singing the exact same praises of God over and over again. He says, let your gentleness be known to everyone, although generousness or benevolence or maybe even forbearance might be better translations. The idea in the Greek is that we rejoice in the Lord less by acting happy and telling others that we're rejoicing, and more by engaging folks with goodness and generosity, and continuing to do so even in the face of opposition, which sounds a whole lot like loving our neighbors as Jesus did and commanded us to do. And Paul also says not to worry, but to offer prayer and thanksgiving to God in everything, which is easier said than done, but does point us to the truth that rejoicing in the Lord involves ongoing conversation with God in both the good times and the bad. And then he says, finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence and if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Now, it's easy to read this verse simply as a command to consider the good things in life rather than dwelling on the bad ones. But Paul may be doing something a little more complicated than preaching the power of positive thinking. Paul's letters and other New Testament writings contain several lists of virtues, like this list, naming qualities that Jesus' followers should identify and emulate. But this list is unusual in that most of the virtues he names do not appear in other New Testament lists, but do show up in non-Christian virtue lists. Indeed, even today, there's nothing uniquely Christian about being true or honorable or excellent. And unlike the other New Testament virtue lists, this one doesn't end with a call to action that the reader should be these things. Rather, Paul tells us to think about these things or take these things into account. So, what he might be saying is that part of the way we rejoice in the Lord always is to find what is true and honorable and just in the secular world and take that into account, using it to help us love our neighbors rather than dismissing it as unimportant because it isn't explicitly Christian. And this would apply not only to words and music and art that express what is true in pleasing ways, but also to the just and honorable behavior of people who practice other religions or no religion. When we identify and engage with such good things, when we name and support that which is excellent and commendable, even though it comes from outside our Christian circles, then we come closer to rejoicing always, even when what's going on seems to be mostly rotten. Now, there still may be an element of what the heck, Paul, insofar as even with all of those qualifiers, rejoicing always still sounds like an impossible task. But for Paul, rejoicing does not fall entirely on each individual. In this passage, rejoice is a plural imperative. So it's y'all rejoice in the Lord always. We tend to think of joy as an individual emotion, a personal overflow of good feeling in response to happy circumstances. But for Paul, rejoicing in the Lord is communal. It's a shared outpouring. He is not telling Euodia and Syntyche and Clement to rejoice individually, but to rejoice together. Joy that is not shared is joy that is not complete to his thinking. Which is, of course, part of our problem right now. It's not just that all these bad things are happening in the world and in our own lives. It's that whatever joy we do find has been hard or impossible to share. For 6 months, we didn't gather as a church community at all. And that's 6 months of potential joy that we weren't able to share amongst ourselves. And it'll be more months before we can worship without masks as part of a full Sunday morning that includes coffee and conversation, or indeed even be in the church consistently every Sunday. And that's before considering the family members and friends with whom we've not been able to share joy except through a phone or a screen. But even in prison, where he did not have the option of rejoicing in person with the full community, Paul nonetheless rejoiced in the Lord. And even when we are bombarded by things that make us sad and angry and afraid, we too can listen for God's invitation to find joy. In Jesus' parable this morning, all these random people are walking the streets, minding their own business, when a passing slave interrupts them and invites them to a wedding banquet. And it seems that most of them chose to take a break from whatever normal thing they were doing and rejoice in the Lord by attending the party. So let us not worry about rejoicing always as individuals when we feel a range of emotions and face a host of challenges and less than joyful events. Let us instead choose to rejoice in whatever is true and just and commendable and pleasing in the world around us, wherever we can find it. And let us choose not to resist joy when God interrupts and invites us to celebrate. And let us choose to rejoice with the community whenever and however we can. And let us choose to share our own joy with God's people, so that every moment in some part of the body of Christ throughout the world, the church is following Paul's command and rejoicing.